Yeah, so we were something like this. We were trying to figure out what a soul is, right? Remember? Yeah, that was the point. And in order to do that, I was talking about different things that we really want to figure out, right? But anyways, we want to figure out what a soul is, or at least secondarily, what the Jewish tradition at least thinks of when it talks about a soul. And in order to do that, right, that was my main shmiz last time. In order to do that, we need to understand two things. We need to do two things. That's the two things that we discussed. We need to sort of understand what they're saying, not just be confused and like reading people that read people that the basic terms that already got different meanings and so on. And we need to so we need to read them actually, and we need to also try to figure out the conceptual or metaphysical or philosophical basis that they have within which they're working, without which nothing makes sense. And we spoke a little about these need for these kind of two things. Basically, that's what we spoke about, and I keep on seeing more of the need of this, and sort of think that all of my work that I'm recently doing and trying to read things is to figure out what people actually mean, or what underlies the concepts and the words that people use, because this guy was explaining very nicely actually today. I was reading. No, this guy. You want to know this person? Where it's like he says it's like learning a foreign language in the other volume that's here. It's like learning a foreign language, or you go to a foreign country, to a different country, and you find out that a lot of the things that you thought the way the world must work, there's actually a different way of doing it. Then you come back home and you find yourself somewhat strange at home, because like it's like a law of the universe that you have to eat a certain kind of breakfast or whatever cultures have, and the same thing or doubly so is for thoughts. And one of the big mistakes that people make, this is mostly the second point that I was saying, I find it very important. One of the big blindness that people have, basically, if you read, he's speaking about if you read analytical philosophers explaining Aristotle, they like explicitly do this. That's their whole point. Is like to ignore what words meant or what kind of concepts underlied Aristotle's thinking, for example, and try to like read it in plain English, and because they're very interested in like clarifying their thoughts. But it turns out that clarifying your thoughts is a very contingent thing, because you're basically clarifying the biases of your culture and not really thinking. And while doing the historical thing, which is figuring out what he thought in his context, then you could say, okay, well, we think of reality in basically different ways, but then you could start to even compare these two things. And the big thing that I think, which is going back to sort of the first point, and I've noticed, is that you cannot take. I discussed this with you last week, right? We don't know anything about ourselves. One of the crazy mistakes that people seem to make, I don't know why, and I don't know where we got this mistake. Basically, probably from laziness. That's what the Rambam would say. That you could sort of just read a text, and if you're smart enough, you'll figure out what he's talking about. So you get people. I mean, the radical example would be reading Kabbalah, for example, which is like this whole body of knowledge where it exists. We could sort of define it by, it's contained in such and such books. And people can seriously go around saying, okay, this is all this, but I don't know what it's about. There's all these words and all these structures and all these explanations, but what are they about? And then people can actually have the guts or something to come today and say, well, I don't know, I'm a smart guy, I could just read it and figure out what it's about. Well, you can't. And a big part of the history of trying to explain Kabbalah in the modern times, I think, I would include a lot of people that people wouldn't like that I say in this analysis, is people sort of just putting their own, I totally see this, right? People just putting their own assumptions in, like reading it as if it says something else. While I think that the only way to understand it is to try to do some research and figure out what concepts meant for them or in their context. And it might not correspond to anything that you think. And most of explanations, like, people go around, you read it of Ashlag, right? He says, well, all these Mekabalim don't know what they're talking about because they can't explain it in modern terms. Well, I could, but you just ruined all of it. Because you... for example, yeah.
Says it about what? I'm confused.
About all the Mekabalim, besides for him, basically.
What, that they can't praise the...
Yeah, because he comes to Bethel, for example, which is the traditional Kabbalah yeshiva in Yerushalayim, existing for like hundreds of years, whatever, something like that. And he asks him, okay, so you're learning this stuff, and you could explain it to me very well internally, right? You can define everything by the definitions in the other pages of the book.
What's he looking to correspond to?
But what is it? What is it about? And they say, I don't know, just about this. It's not about anything. And he looks at them and says, well, you people are crazy. And they might be crazy. I'm not saying that they're not crazy. But I think that this kind of criticism is totally wrong.
Because I'm guessing for Ashlag, then he needs it to, meaning what the Mikabalim at least were trying to refer to was they were trying to refer
to the things that he thinks are important. To the things that he thinks are important. That's what it boils down to. He basically sits down and does his sort of works with his concepts, whatever he thinks are real concepts, based on certain books that he read or certain thoughts that he had, whichever they are.
But it corresponds to maybe not closed concepts, meaning it's not a concept that just pertains to its own system.
There's no concepts that are not like that.
I'm saying
all systems only pertain to themselves. That's a mistake, you see.
Okay, no, but
if they're consistent. If they're not consistent, then that's a problem. All coherent systems can only be explained in their own terms. Or you could make sort of translate it into a different system if it's like isomorphic to it.
Well,
but
there are truths that are more broad than others, right?
That's fine.
In terms of how much reality they relate to.
Yeah,
the
but the Mekabolim, any
is the most expensive property in monopoly is not as important as whether or not they.
Yeah, of course. But we're speaking about systems that are trying to explain all of reality, at least in some broad terms, right? Maybe not to the level of every detail. Every good philosophy or theology is supposed to explain everything, which means that it's just a conceptualization for everything, and some kind of conceptualization. What he's not like about people just doing that is that they're not translating it into something else, which is to me very silly demand. And it's really a recipe for not understanding anything, because it's a recipe for forcing everyone into your own words, which is like, whatever. If you're so sure that your concepts are the correct ones, then maybe you should do that. I mean, everyone really does this. It's just that when you start noticing it starts getting on your nerves. Because when people demand, explain it to me. Well, I explained it to you. It just doesn't. I don't need to translate it into what your terms. There's no need for that. And actually, not only there's no need for that, I think that you often, this is an example, but you need to know more about it. What? Yeah, you either lose the point or you're just saying something else, which is nice, but has very little to do with what that person believes or with what that person is trying to get across. Maybe, in other words, I would say something like this. Maybe the point of the Mekabolim, and I'm just using this example, but you need to have more context for it to make sense. Maybe their point is actually not in there's 4 levels or whatever. Maybe their point is actually in what underlies it. And this is just what system they happen to be able to use to elaborate the details of it. But maybe their point is really precisely the place where Rabbi Ashlag disagrees with the Mekabolim. That's their main point. Which means that when you're disagreeing with the main point, you're missing everything, although you could use all their words. So it's sort of quite the opposite of what he would assume. And I'm not saying that he's wrong, that he didn't get the correct concept, but that's another. I do think that he's wrong, but at least on some level he's wrong, but that's a different discussion. I'm trying to say that this strategy of demanding things to be explained on my terms, when generally people don't say that. They say, just explain it to me. But explain it to me means use concepts that I already know. And it might be that I think that your concepts are just wrong or not adequate or not correct or not the only one. At least the thing that I definitely believe that they're not the only ones. Nobody's concepts are the only ways to
Socrates
think.
tried to do exactly. Socrates tried to make sure he didn't make this mistake.
He tried to dry people up until they should sort of give up on their conceptual worlds.
Right, but he works within their own, right? The idea with asking pointed questions.
Yeah, and his but I think that his esoteric point is that you need to give up your system of thought and buy mine. And he never tells you what his is, so that's his dictionary.
Strategy is not done by trying to convert.
Yeah, but it's by trying to show inconsistencies in that person's system. Yeah, of course, Seder. But he's not coming. He's actually showing you that you do not have words, and your system ends up tying itself into knots because it can't explain certain things, and he never says what his system is. But I mean, sometimes he does. But the Platonists would at least claim that there is a system that solves these problems. Okay. And anyways, that's a very important point, and it goes with the second point that I also explained last time, which was that you don't know anything about it by yourself. And I find this very weird. Like, I'll give an example, a radical example, extreme example for this kind of tendency. Like, In yeshiva they say, you can learn everything from the Torah. The Chazon Ish knew how to make brain surgery because he read the Tosfos. Now, I don't say that that's not true. Maybe it's possible, but I don't believe that you could figure it out by yourself. I think the Chazon Ish makes this mistake all the time, and his students definitely make it. In other words, they rely a lot on their sort of intuition, like I'm a smart guy, and since let's say the principle of brain surgery on the Torah, that's a different. We can discuss if that's true or not. Like who says? I don't know, but the Ramban says maybe, or someone. Okay, so maybe it's true, but I do not trust you. I have no reason to believe that you could derive it by yourself without help of basically the book where everyone else learns brain surgery. Because people just don't have innate knowledge, not at that level. It just doesn't work like that. And as a matter of fact, I think that, this is my experience in so many things, where I could read a whole book, which is like, this is an example, right? I could read a whole book which is sort of working in a certain system, a certain based, like my theory is every book is based in a certain world or a certain conceptual world, or not every book. Usually it's a generational thing or a location thing where you could start noticing, but now most books, if they're written well, actually trick you because you're a smart guy and you know what most of the words mean because you know English or Hebrew or whatever the language is, and you're like, okay, I could figure this out. And then people end up just making up such stupid pshatim, and there's no way out of this. You could look at people in Lakewood reading Meir Nevuchim, basically making this claim, like, okay, I'm a smart guy, I could understand Tosfos, why shouldn't I be able to understand this? And he reads it, and he just comes up with a different book, one that the Rambam didn't even dream of writing. And this is a fair question to ask. What do you mean? It's written so badly? You could claim that it's written badly. I don't think it's written so badly. I think that if you know the concept that he's working with, it's actually written very clearly. But there is no way to magically figure out this concept just because you're a smart guy. You need to actually learn and study it. You need to actually do the work of reading the books that he'd bought or read, some whatever. Figure it out. Find a way to read it. There's no other way. And it's even hard to signal to you that you don't get it without just doing that actual work of reading the source or reading the concepts.
Maybe this is just my understanding of it. Like if I'm reading something sometimes, like it's going well, and then like I reach a paragraph, it's just not going.
Yeah.
And like it takes me a while until I finally get like some sort of like.
You didn't realize any of them.
And then like I go back and reread the entire chapter, and it was vaguely intelligible to me prior, but now like it actually makes sense. Like,
that's the gift. People that some authors do this well, and some don't. And some people are too smart for their own good, so they can figure out a meaning for those. So this is true. This is what should happen. You should become some place where it just totally doesn't work with the made-up explanation that you made up, and then you say, well, I must retrace everything. Most people.
Words almost,
sometimes you do understand it because it's sort of because words are very tricky. Right, and they have meaning, different meanings in different languages.
Right, sure.
And you're reading it in a different language than it was written, but it sort of makes sense. And then you get one to the one. You should. That should happen. That should happen. There's two problems. There's three different things that cause people to not. That shouldn't happen. One is that they just don't have training to do that. In other words, if you actually go to yeshiva, it's a good question if they train how they train you. But this kind of thought of like, well, there's some certain. Let me frame it in a different way. There are certain questions which should make you realize that you didn't understand at A yet. You're not up to T, where there's like a steer between T and Z. You just don't understand anything. But I think that it's very hard for people to realize when most people are not trained to notice those kind of things. And I think this a lot. I work a lot with questions that work like this when I learn anything, and you sometimes see it in very obvious ways. Well, there's like two kinds of questions basically. There's one kind of question which is, okay, I seem to have understood, and there seems to be a contradiction or seems to be something not totally worked out. That's one level of question. Then sometimes you have certain kinds of questions which are so basic that either the guy I'm reading is crazy and I should just drop the book because it's a waste of time, or I totally don't understand anything he said. And just knowing the difference in these two questions is very hard for people. I think that people are not trained to do that. I think that you could think of concepts like, for example, if you need to give an example that you went through for length, I don't know what. Take Pshita Shel Mikra, right, as a subject, okay? The simple meaning of the biblical text. It took a long time for people to realize, and there's a history of this, at least in the Jewish context, there's a history of it, probably in other contexts, took a long time for people to realize that when Rashi is arguing with the Rashbam himself sort of realized this at some point, but like it's not like a question of like whose prat is better. It's just that one person is just reading totally wrong. Just your whole way of assumptions of like making medrash and like finding the medrash that works the best. That's not what we should be doing. We should just be reading it and figuring out what it means. Nowadays we would say in the context in which it was written or something like that. And that, how do you get to that? Because there's a good answer. If you read medrash, there's a teretz to every kasha that the Ibn Ezra has. There's no questions remain. There's always an answer for every question. And that's the point of medrash. He does that. He uses all these questions for his purposes. So how do you ever get out of that? You understand my point? You need to have some kind of external, some sort of meta mind which says, yeah, these are all good answers, but they don't answer any of the questions. The questions are too good, or there's different value, different quality. There's some, the way I would say it is, when you see a certain question that it doesn't seem like the person writing the book would have ever dreamed of asking, then either you two are not on the same page.
Certain answers to certain questions like are operationally good, but they're not significant enough, or they're not. They don't.
It's not. It might be.
The question as they work. Meaning, if you want to know in terms of like sequential thought, you could technically put an answer after this question, and the question doesn't exist. But
I think there's more than that. I think there's more. Yeah, I often use things like this, and I'm not the only one. Like if you see a question that only becomes this basic question in the sugya, and it only becomes a question last week, something is wrong with everyone's understanding. It can't be. So what the answer is always hard to figure out. That's one reason. Now, second thing, so number one, people are not trained to realize this, and if they would be trained to realize this, maybe a lot of different books wouldn't exist. So you have to realize that. And secondly, there's two other things people could say. Secondly, people are in the traditional Jewish context. People are too smart for their own good often, because they could figure out some shtickle Torah to answer all questions. They never realize that. Yeah, that's a good. Like you're saying, yeah, there's a question and an answer, but there's something wrong here. And people are very often too smart for their own good to realize that. Especially smart people have this problem.
Doesn't confront the question on its own terms.
Yeah, like there's some I could give you so many examples, but you have to already agree to the example for it to work. So I don't know. No.
Okay, so you could try one just so I can understand.
There's so many examples like this. I take a book that's controversial when it was written. Okay, some example. Okay. Now, there was a fake Yerushalmi, like for example, I don't know, things like that. Now, for every question, you have to understand. For every question that there is that sort of proves that this is fake, this is not authentic. If you're the bigger genius you are, the less this is a problem for you. There's actually examples. If you're the Klichem, actually he was against it. There were people. There's historical examples of this. People that because they're very used to coming up with really creative answers for every problem and so on. There's some glaring things that everyone that knows a little how to learn and sees this says there's something wrong. He never realizes that because your head is full of these kind of contradictions, and you have 14 different tiritzim for every kasha, whatever. And then there's never wait, this is something not working. It's a tricky criticism to make because sometimes it's hard to figure out which way it is, but that's the point. You want a better example? I don't have a better example right now. You could see this often in certain critical debates about different things, where the people that are very good, they're actually very smart, but because they're so smart, they have a pilpul for everything, and they never you could say they just don't know how to think straight, but I don't think it's enough to say that.
No, for me also, a lot of people have isolated answers for certain questions, but when you try to get when you try to figure out what the attitude was towards things, it starts to become there doesn't seem to be any fixed stance towards the topic. There's no vantage point that seems to be consistent. It's always okay. Now we have a different question. I'll approach it from a different angle, and we can solve it working within this way.
Yeah, okay, but I'm not sure what.
Sometimes it's hard to.
People just don't think clearly. You're just talking about people not thinking clearly, which is another.
No, but it's clear. I can understand the question and answer. It's just something's a little fishy about how the
there's no general understanding.
It's always hard to uncover an attitude towards a question. It's very subtle.
Possibly.
There's 4 bit. What's the thing? Right. Even it was funny because like sometimes people phrase it as like the difference between why and how, but it's like I think Hume has like 4 understandings of why, right? Why is a mechanical why, a teleological why, a and then one of like a justifying why. There's like a few different types, and sometimes you know the modern word why kind of grabs all of them and says it's basically the same thing. But when you read books that aren't working within this and they use 4, I don't know if it's 4, it could be this 14, but different uses of the word why, you sort of
Okay.
like when a judge asks, the example
Yeah,
that I was
okay.
reading about, when a judge asks a guy why he did something and he says, look, there were electronic impulses in my brain, right? It's the answer, and this is a very stupid example because it's maybe a matter of intention, but even the why that he wanted was not the
Okay,
why. The
and what
answer's
is
why.
this? Don't connect it to what to
I'm
where
not
I am.
sure. I'm not even sure how I got here.
Not sure.
No, I think there was a reason why I got here, but
Okay.
I try to trace it back. But
Anyways, so no, I was just saying that in order to realize that there's different conceptual worlds underlying things, you need to either believe that, like realize that sometimes people actually tell it to you explicitly, but since people are so used to reading their own word understandings and things, they don't get it. Either what you were saying, one of the ways in which it should work is by realizing that there's some basic questions that like glare at you, and the people. I was saying that there's challenges with this. One of them is that people never do that. Second is that there is answers to questions, and if you're smart enough, you could figure out a way of reading everything, which is just totally wrong. And the third one is what happens. You would say a more modern thing that happens, which is that people don't trust the things they're reading to actually make sense. So if you read like some modern academics writing about different things, and he's really doing this, he's like saying, well, what you're saying makes no sense in my concepts, but and then he just says, well, so you're wrong. So obviously you didn't think this through very well, and sometimes it's true. I don't know. Yeah, and I don't know. Sometimes it's true, like that everyone right? No, probably not. There's probably even internal to their system. Sometimes there's things that people didn't think through. But sometimes it's very obvious that there is a question here, but it's not the question that you're asking because you just don't know how. You never occurred to you. By the way, this is not only a modern thing. I mean, it happens in it happens in yeshiva too, and so on, in different ways. There's different kosher ways of criticizing previous people, and people make the same mistakes all the time. So yeah. So that's why it doesn't happen, and what I was saying, which is important to me, is that you don't get it by yourself. There's no like I'm just gonna be smart and figure it out. That's just not how it works. Anyways, let's get to somewhere. So in order to do all of that, we need to learn a little bit, and since we want to know what the soul is about, so we need to learn what people have tried to talk about it. So Rabbi Sadia Gun was one of the first people to try systematic Jewish theology, philosophy, whatever you want to call it. And he also sort of formulates certain concepts or certain ways of thinking, attitudes, and ways of thinking which survive. If you could trace it, they survive very well, although in many ways the Rambam overshadowed him in a lot of things. But there's still a whole stream of thought which sort of takes its start from Rabbi Sadia, not from the Rambam, or combines them in different ways and so on, and it's very good, useful to know how it works. So basically, when I started here, and Rav Sadia's book we probably did this already, is sort of structured, and not entirely structured, but at least that's what he says in his preface, that it's going to be structured like this, that he wants to show that the Jewish, not only Jewish, rabbinical, right, also against Karaim and things like that, the exact specific opinions that he holds or believes are correct, or at least probable from an intellectual standpoint. And for this, he comes up with his whole theory of what we discussed about the sources of truth, where the truth has, well, in general, in the most general terms, 2 sources. One of which is, what we would call rational truth, which is based on, he has a theory of that too, which is sort of a certain theory, which we could talk about, because probably a lot of things are based on this, but it basically has this, how did we say, three, he calls it three three sources of rational truth, one of which is sense data, well, we call that way. Second is basic intellectual truths, which he sees as sort of a separate source. They don't come. They're not empirical. They just come from your mind.
They sound too modern by saying it's like a synthetic.
Yeah. Don't put in these words. It's not going to help us too much.
Okay.
No, because synthetic thoughts are about the world. And anyways, it's not going to help us too much. You could think after that. I'm just telling you. And the third one are deductive truths or truths that we sort of get by combining either senses with these basic thoughts or those basic thoughts themselves and so on.
Okay.
So these are his three sources of truth. In some way, the first two are more basic, and then built on that, you get the third one. And then, besides all that, but that's not so important for now. That's a whole different discussion of how to do epistemology, where we know things from. Yeah, this is not for. I don't have enough to work with that now.
Make a quick tour, just because I'm curious.
Yeah, we're gonna get to it.
Still catching up with the last point. No, what we were saying earlier. I'm just curious if maybe this example will just demonstrate that I didn't understand, or maybe I did. But like what James says about like Pascal's wager, right? Pascal's wager is very easy criticism, right? But after James finishes his whole drusha, it's not so simple that like right, because with the whole life hypothesis idea. So I'm saying is that like an example of like people ask easy questions on Pascal, right? On the wager, right? It's not sensible. Whatever.
No, okay, yeah, yes and no. I don't want to.
Okay,
I'm gonna get
curious.
confused.
Okay.
Yes and no. Yes and no. That's the answer to everything. Okay, very easy way to get out of everything. The answer is yes and no.
Okay, that's just curious.
Yeah, it's one way, but he sort of doesn't give you a rational way to formulate that. I think that there's a rational way to formulate it. Understand? And James, like he will tell you he sort of notices this basic thing where for Pascal, it's a live, what you call it, a live action. It makes sense to go to mass and believe in the holy water, and for William James, it doesn't make any sense. Like there's other things that might make sense, but this doesn't make sense. But I think that now he doesn't really explain why these things would be like this. I think that in general these things are true because I don't think they're not rational. I think that they're because of, well, in the context that we're talking about, usually they're because of metaphysical assumptions. In other words, like I always give this example, for someone with certain assumptions of how the soul works, to talk about transmigration of souls, right, known as Gilgul, makes sense. It might be true, it might not be true, but it's not crazy. It's a real option. Whereas for someone with a different concept of soul, it doesn't even make sense. It doesn't even begin to be an option. But that's not because just he lives in France and he lives in the United States, which is basically what's going on with him. It's because maybe there's some metaphysical, but it's not really about that. But it's really because of a basic metaphysical assumption or attitude or concept that you're working with. So that's really what I'm talking about here. So, but it is, there might be social things from that also. What was I saying? Mekitzer, but now you confuse me. Okay, so there's three sources of truth, but in general they're rational or universal sources of truth. We could call them accessible to any human being as long as it work. Like I sort of disagree with this because I think you need to be taught everything, but that's another discussion. But it's at least what we call in justification context, it's rational. Although it might not be get to you in rational ways. Maybe that's not how the world works. Okay. Anyways, yeah. Don't go there. It's fine. Point is, it's rational, and then there is what we would call tradition, or he actually calls accepting on edut, witness, right? Believing through someone else, right? Because someone told me, and that person is reliable to me. In the end of the day, it's going to go back to the rational. I have to understand it. There's only one basic way of knowing, which is the rational way, or the sense way, or basically what we call the rational way. But so he doesn't have. This is very important to realize. For Sadia, Rabbeinu Sadia going, there is only at its base, and this is unlike what mystics would say. Very importantly, and mystics meaning from Plato on, or some Platonists. It's a very old thought. There is only one way of knowing, which is the rational way. In other words, I see something, hear something, think something, based on very basic, simple thoughts, and do logic. Okay, including prophecy. Prophecy is just I see God in some way. How that works. There must be a way for it to work and get to a basic sense level. That's for him very important because there's no like extra supra rational way of knowing. It's not like, well, the way a prophet knows is the way you would know in a religious experience, like James would tell you, or something. It's just a different way of knowing. He doesn't have any of that. It's very. If you want to be like a real rationalist, he's a very naive rationalist in that sense. very simple rationalist. There's only that way, including prophecy. Of course, prophecy means that God speaks to you, but he must speak to you in the way, and he must prove it to you that he speaks to you also in a very basic, evidentiary way, in a very basic, he needs to see something or understand something. That's all there is going on. But since humans, and he gives this a long explanation, since humans most of the time, or most of them, are not capable or not, we didn't figure out everything. So it's natural and it's correct. It's epistemologically right. It's okay to believe people on trust, or to believe testimony. Basically, someone told me. Well, there's some things that we can only believe in testimony, like facts that happened in the past. Either you believe or you don't. That's one thing. But even for how the world actually works, you ask the scientist and so on, and he tells you
specialized knowledge, right?
Yeah, and so he sort of understands this, and it's a big question in the end for him. Like, are there really things that it's not really possible for anyone to know in a rational way? It's only like because God told the prophet. So how does that exactly work? But in basic sense, this is how he understands things. Now, therefore, and of course, he's going to tell you there's some rules for believing testimony also, right? Basically, the rules change from being about the subject to being about the person, right? You need to know that the person is trustworthy, that the tradition is trustworthy. You need to have some sort of criteria of making a difference between trustworthy traditions and non-trustworthy ones, and the ones that he gives are the precise opposite of the one that Kuzri gives. But anyways, okay. So, but these are rational thoughts. You could think, what kind of tradition am I supposed to believe or take seriously? And now, since he of course takes seriously the Jewish tradition, of course there's in Yitzchok, right? If something is obviously rationally wrong, then tradition doesn't help you, because again, for him, the rational ways of knowing are the only ways of knowing, and testimony is only a way to get a shortcut. That's how he literally defines it as a shortcut, and he sees it as like a nice thing of God to give people traditional knowledge, because most people otherwise, would never find things out because we just don't have time and space and things like that. But at its base, there's only that kind of knowledge, which means that there's no tradition that can make me believe something which is opposite to what I can see with my eyes or think with my mind. And therefore, even if there's a pasuk that says something which is contrary to reason, we have to reinterpret the pasuk if it's clearly a contradiction. Maybe there's other strategies for taking care of that, but it's always the reason is always going to win for him. Really, because there's only reason, or because these two sources must correspond, or really one is based on the other. If you think about it in that basic way. Yeah, that's even making it more complicated. But he would say the pasuk is someone telling you this, and if this is a trustworthy person, then he must not be telling you that, but something else, because it's just not true. But yeah, it's sort of not. This needs a better theory of how exactly these kind of reinterpretations are supposed to work. But okay, that's just giving you the how I understand the epistemology that he has, not how I understand his interpretive strategies and so on. Now, being that this is his basic understanding, so now he's going to write a book, and his plan is, I will give you the traditional testimony, what God has told us through his prophets and Chachamim and so on, and I will try to prove it to you, and sort of show you how these two sources of truth are saying the same thing. And of course, not everything can actually. Now, this is important. He's explicit about this in different areas, and about mitzvahs and so on. Not everything can be rationally proven. And the basic way I would say it is something like this: everything has to be rationally possible, and not impossible, because they have this modal understanding, right? There are facts which are just happen to be so, and there are facts that must be so, and therefore everything and facts that can't be, right? So these are three things. That's what basically the Arab philosophers taught this kind of logic. It's in Aristotle already, but they very much clarified it this way. They said there are three kinds of facts, okay? There are really four kinds of facts, basically, but they would say something like this, because there's two axes on which to divide facts, right? One is it so, and one is must it be so, or necessarily so, right? Exactly. So therefore, you end up with three or four categories, depending on how you want to count. You end up with things which necessarily must be so, right? Necessary truths, which, right, like 1 and 1 must be 2. There's no way for it to be something else, or that's not really a good example. But anyways, the law of contradiction must be true, and there's no way for it to be false, and therefore that's a necessary truth, right? So that even the Torah can't contradict. If there'll be a mitzvah that says believe 1 and 1 is 2, you just throw it out. It's not useless. No way to tell you that. And there's also things that are necessarily false, which is the opposite of those things, basically. And again,
Why do you think it's the opposite of
necessarily false. No, there's things that are necessarily false. Like, well, that's a good question what those things are. This becomes a huge controversy in the Rambam and so on. But basically, 1 and 1 can't be 7. That's necessarily so. It's not. There's no possible in the way. Yeah, it might be whatever, depending on your. It might be this just this flip side of this, or this might be some things that don't entirely have a correspondence. Didn't think about this. There might be natural things like this. It becomes very complicated when you actually think through which things are in which category. But there's at least such a category of things which must be, and there's things that cannot be, or you would say necessarily false. What was I saying? Sadiq actually is such a rationalist that he actually thinks this is true for ethics also. There are things that are necessarily good and there are things that are necessarily bad. So it's not only true for facts; it's also true for what we would call values, right? And he thinks this way.
Now my first question is, I think, a little more relevant.
Wait,
in terms of
because
1 doesn't equal 7 because it equals 2, or if it doesn't equal 7.
It doesn't. I don't know what difference it is.
No,
there is for that right now.
Because one leaves room for some sort of. If you believe 1 plus 1 can't equal 7 because 1 plus 1 equals 2, that's in terms of concrete aspects of reality like that, we're definitely not going to admit that any sort of pluralism. It can't work. It's not functional.
Yeah. In real things, it becomes very complicated. Only for apps. I know, but that's how he thinks. Okay. He thinks there's something that are most definitely bad or necessarily bad. It might be only like by analogy. I don't know if he's really thinks that they're necessary. I'm not sure. I think he does actually think that they're necessary, but I don't know how well he thought this through exactly, that it doesn't make sense. I'm not sure. Anytime you apply this to anything concrete, it becomes very complicated, which people realized already a long time ago. But anyways, there's only so basically those two things are not relevant to any tradition, right? Either it must be this way and it cannot be that way. Right, in any possible world is how people would say it nowadays. Right, so therefore those things are, for these things the Torah is irrelevant, right? Of course, it might be relevant in the sense of letting you know something that you would just in the way of letting people know because they didn't think of it by themselves, but it's not relevant in an informative sense, right? But it could be relevant not in facts and not in mitzvahs. In other words, not this will be, there will be Tchias HaMaisim, although it's impossible, then it won't be, or it must be Tchias HaMaisim. Then again, it's not interesting, not giving you any no information. Where is it relevant, and where is the information in the Torah relevant, both for facts and for mitzvahs? Which I said he explicitly says that it's in the category of ethics, but I don't know. Is in the middle category, which is most of the world anyway. It's not like it sounds very small, but it's most of the universe, which is the possible, what they call the possible or the contingent world, right? Where things are possible. It could be this way. It could be that Moshe Rabbeinu brought to a leichas. It could be that it didn't. There's nothing in the nature of things to force one way or the other.
Or make it necessary.
What?
There's no inherent nature of the world that makes sense.
Yeah. Or he would say something like this. It could be that one should pray 1 time, 3 times a day. It could be you should pray 5 times a day, like the Muslims say. There's no natural, none of these things are necessary. And for these things, we have prophecy, which tells us the correct. That's why there's 4 categories, right? There's things that are possible but happened, and there are things that are possible that didn't happen, right? So false and true things in the category of the possible. And that's where we have both the Torah, which kill us things, like prophecy could tell you, might be able to tell you, there will be Tchias HaMaisim, which is not rationally necessary. In other words, it cannot provable. It's sort of close to be the same thing. I can't give you a proof of Tchias HaMaisim happening, and I do have to, but this is important, but I do have to prove you that it's possible. Because if it would be impossible by the laws of nature, by necessarily laws, by provable ways, by demonstrative ways, then the Torah can't be saying it, then we'll have to reinterpret the Torah. Just like when we know that it's demonstratively impossible for God to have a body, and even though it says in the Pusik, we have to reinterpret it because there's no way out. So it's very important.
Is there or at least some sort of like independent method of like obviously for him there's necessary times to understand the pasuk differently, but then the times where why should we understand any pasuk of the truth?
Yeah. He sort of asked this question, and he just says that by default we believe we read things literally until we have a good reason not to. He doesn't. I don't know.
For whether or not that deviation exists in every pasuk.
No, because this is how I don't know why. Yeah, I think he asked this question, and this is his answer. I can't really tell you why, if there's a good reason for doing this, but that's what he thinks, what he says. You just in general, we assume that it's literal until we have a reason not to. Where this default comes from, that's what he says. Okay. Anyways, I'm not interested in again interpretation right now. I'm just interested in his philosophy right now, and what he says. Therefore, this is where it's important. Therefore, when he's talking about how the world works, what he needs to do is really two things. Well, he can tell you what he thinks says it. This is also something interesting, right? He can tell you what he thinks says in the tradition, what the prophets say, or what the rabbis say, and that's something that he does because everything has 1,000 interpretations without any reason. So that's interesting. It's really interesting because he generally just assumes that his interpretation is what it says, which is sometimes somewhat weird. Like in basic things, everyone sort of agrees. There's a God and created the world. I don't know. To some extent, most people agree that that's what it says. When we start talking about the soul and how Tchias works, no two Jews agree before philosophy. And he just this is what the tradition says, and now we just have to figure out the reason about it. And what he can do is he really needs to do is he doesn't need to prove everything. He doesn't he doesn't need to prove. He would like to, but he can't. He doesn't need to prove every fact of it, but he needs to make it possible. That's the important thing. He needs to prove that it's possible. Because if the soul is such that
it's not
necessarily false, right? For example, if the soul would be just naturally something about the body, which is the way an accident of the body, then none of this would make sense. So therefore, he has to this. Right? It's the second. It's the first one. Second one, and his number. Yeah. Then none of his. Then the Torah can't work, or whatever the Torah says about the soul can't work. So that has to be pushed away, and we have to find some sort of account of soul which can hold everything the Torah says. That's it. That's what he's doing. Everything pre-exists. Everything pre-exists. No, he doesn't think they compose Torah. He says the Torah tells you this is what he says, and if you read it, you'll see he says the Torah says certain things. Then he would become a guy. I mean to say, basically, or he would say, well, that's not what the Torah means. Of course, you could always say that. He probably generally wants. Yeah, he admits to being an apologist, and then that's his basic framing for everything. He is here to show you that the Torah is passable, at least. So if you could even show you that it's necessary, but that's what he's for. He doesn't pretend to be a philosopher. He doesn't pretend, and never. He does think, and this is very important. People have discussed it about in this context a lot. Tzaddik doesn't pretend to be a philosopher. In other words, he doesn't pretend to be someone that starts with a clean slate and says, "Well, I'm just going to figure out how the world is." He never pretends that. But he does very clearly think that is the correct way of thinking. Of course, the Rambam criticizes him when he says that he's not, but that's really what he thinks. He doesn't believe that, in other words, his epistemology, his basic way of understanding how thinking should work is definitely that one should think clearly from zero, reason from from these sources of truth. He doesn't ever say this is important. This is what keeps him straight, right? And actually very straight. And in a certain sense, you could.
Invents an origin point, meaning after the Torah. And he says you have Torah, and then we're going to.
It's not. It's two different things. He sees that as two independent ways of working. Torah is the easy way, and the reason is the long way. He doesn't see them, and the reason is really independent and even basic in some sense, because that's the only kind of things that exist for him, or the only kind of knowledge that exists. So there's not another kind of knowledge. This is very important. In other words, if he would be saying, and you could accuse him of being not of being biased because he already knows where he wants to get to. Yeah, you could say that, but you cannot say, but that's already an external criticism.
Bias. I'm not trying to figure out bias. I'm saying that either is or isn't.
Yeah, everyone has bias anyway. It doesn't help too much.
Yeah, no.
So right, which means that, but you cannot accuse him of distorting what knowledge should be because he wants to get to a certain conclusion.
No, I'm just saying it's a to me it's just an awkward point to start with this not clean slate but almost clean slate after the Torah. Meaning
these are for him two different things.
In his order,
they're like two different roads. He accepts, at least tentatively, right? He accepts what it says because he believes that that's a source of truth, and because assuming, of course, it's not really historically true because he was born as a Jew and probably just believed what his mother told him. But he at least pretends to say, or at least if you ask him what's the justification, he would tell you, well, because this is a reliable tradition. There's good rational reasons for accepting what it says in the way of taqlid, right? In the way of accepting things that are told to you, in the way of believing testimony, which is everyone agrees is a rational thing to do. Nobody thinks that there's really something wrong with doing testimony. And then he would tell you, okay, but now either, and he gives you these two options. Either you're a person that doesn't believe in this, right? Well, I don't believe your testimony. Now I just have to start from zero. Or you do believe in it, but you want to know it. These are the two addressees that he's thinking of in his preface. And for both of these, which doesn't really matter, for both of these, now we have to start again. Yeah. And he sees this is really his theory of Torah. His theory of Torah is giving people who a different starting point with which to start, because it's hard for people to start from in the rational way, or we might never get to the truth. No, so therefore, I don't think there's no you can't criticize him of having his way of, he doesn't circle, his theory is not at least to circle the target around the arrow, right, or however you call it. But you could of course say that he's biased. Again, really he's not being honest because he already knows where he wants to get to. You could always say that about everyone.
For Sadia, testimony is about something that's what? What's testimony? What is testimony
for him, it can be about everything. For him, it could be about everything. Well, he thinks that the Torah tells us. Yeah, it could be. Yeah, it could be. Of course, it could be, because in the way of testimony. In other words, if Moshe, or let's say, for example,
how many times did they tell him? He believes that someone.
No, because that's no. He thinks that that's not necessary. He thinks that that's just revelation.
So the testimony is testifying what?
Yeah, for that there's no way to prove it. Just it's
what is it testifying?
No, so there's really two kinds of testimonies, and this is something that I don't know if he I don't remember if he says this clearly. There's really two kinds of things. I think what I think is this has to do with how what prophecy is.
Which is like,
right, but
the car drive by here, so you say yes, whatever. Yeah. And there's a kind of testimony which is, in this area I'm not going to have that kind of knowledge, right? I'll accept testimony from my doctor about what happened to me, but it's not. Yeah, he doesn't.
You have to remember, right? One thing he doesn't have is this. This is a very modern way of thinking. Specialization of knowledge. He doesn't have that. What he has is it's true that there's going to be testimony about two different kinds of things, about necessary things and contingent things. Yes. It doesn't seem to think that there's different kind of ways of believing testimony, and it's probably not, because when you go to your Rebbe and he tells you, look, there's a God and he created the world in 7 days and he told us to pray 3 times a day. Okay, you're just accepting all these 3 things in the same way.
Right, but the testimony has different quality to it, right?
I don't think he doesn't think that, because to him the reason you believe testimony is something very external to the facts of the matter. In other words, why you believe this? Because he would tell you something because, well, I don't remember. He actually has like a list of reasons to believe testimony, like something like, because this guy's a smart guy and usually doesn't lie. So there's basically 2 criteria, because the people that are the chains in this transition, and like the links in this transmission chain have to be both reliable and smart. That's the basic. Sounds reasonable, right? And if you assume that these are reliable, smart people, so that's really corresponds to these 2 things. They're not lying to you and they're not mistaken. Now, of course, the testimony could be about 2 things, and it's not only that. Probably for him, something like prophecy could show you both of these kind of things. Because again, prophecy is really a kind of. This is really where it gets interesting, and I think we have to look more how he theorizes prophecy. I do know what in general terms, but I don't remember every word. For him, prophecy is really God giving people non-demonstrative knowledge. In other words, really God giving people testimony. That's basically what it is. Okay, which means that
not rationally accessible.
They might be separately rationally accessible. This is the important thing. In other words, if God comes, and these are 2 things. For him, God's prophecy exists just as a crutch for people in regards to knowable things, in regards to rationally knowable things. But in totally separate direction. No shaykhs with the tradition.
In other words, would I know that I have to pray 3 times a day?
No, that's not. Again, you're going back to the 2 categories. For rational, for his paradigmatic place where he likes more talking about things that are rationally knowable. So the rationally knowable things can be knowable by testimony, even by God coming and telling you, I'm making a miracle, so you believe it. That's number 1. Or you could just sit down and be a philosopher and figure it out. Right. Now, things that are not rationally knowable, you're only left with the first thing, 100%. You're going to be left.
What is the prophecy
you
about?
Need to believe the guy that God spoke to him and told him to pray 3 times a day. That's all it's about. It's not about anything else.
What do I
there might be reasons that God likes it. That's the question of Tamei Mitzvahs. Yeah, you could say that God's in His infinite wisdom has a reason or something like that. These are 2 ways of describing it. But he sometimes he at least has. No, this is
2 is 135. That's different than God coming over.
Right. But to him the reason it's not. He's sort of how do you call it? He sort of equivocates on this point, and when he talks about Tamei mitzvahs. But there's at least a space. Let's just conceptually. He at least has a space for things which have entirely no inequality. Right? They have entirely no. Uh, um,
Truth quality.
yeah,
Not
exactly.
truth
In other words, the reason why God told it to you is because He told it to you, and maybe because you would say something like He wants to test you if you obey or something like that,
But it's
which
nothing
means that
internal.
there's nothing to know here. Just God wants to see if you listen to Him, and He tells you to pray 3 times and not 4 times, or 3 times and not 2 times, whatever it is, however exactly
It's
it works.
not something that refers to itself. Meaning it's
No, it refers to nothing. It refers to God's
Okay.
will. Is how other people would conceptualize it, at least. But it's not a knowledge. It's not a fact of about the world. It's not knowledge, basically.
Okay.
There's
Oh, it's not okay.
It's just no. There's just nothing to know. It's just we know a historical fact that
Sadi's
God told you.
Sadi says that testimony. He's referring primarily to the first category, or he doesn't discriminate.
Both.
Okay.
Both.
It's very
This
different.
is
That's a
both.
category.
Yeah. But again, for the people that are not thinking, it's the same thing. For the people that are thinking, and this is always a question: to what extent?
Same terms, but what it is that I believe is very different, right?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Of course. Yeah, I think so. I think that, and not only that, there's no point. There's nothing to believe, really. In other words, there's nothing to know. You would say
Well,
there's nothing to know in the
test than the other, right?
meaning.
Much strong, the falsification principle there. By if somebody tells me ate this, it depends if they contradict something. One has no litmus. One has no criteria.
There's not really a criteria for things that can only be known through prophecy, basically. No, I don't think there would be a criteria. The criteria, again, he would think that there's ways to get closer. Like he would claim that, but he doesn't think that's important. He would claim, well, maybe there's some way, in some way, it makes more sense to pray 3 times a day than 5. But he doesn't think that that's the real reason why it exists. He thinks that these are just like, since God is smart, he might as well, get that in also. But not essentially the reason.
Well, that's a tricky line because on some level, even if the ramifications are small, that means that he does believe that, if it would be possible to conduct a thorough investigation about how many times.
No, he doesn't. He doesn't think. He definitely doesn't think that. In other words, sometimes he would say that, but he says that in a rhetorical sense. He definitely doesn't think that everything there's something. He definitely doesn't think that everything. That's where I want to get. He definitely doesn't think that everything is knowable.
And everything could not have been otherwise.
Yeah, that's another way of saying it. Yeah, maybe it could not have been otherwise for God. I don't know, but
okay.
for us, for what's accessible to human reason or human knowledge, he doesn't think that. For example, this is why he has the whole category of mitzvahs shemiyos. That's really what they're about. Things that mitzvahs shemiyot is literally mitzvahs that can only be known through hearing or through testimony. This is just an Arabic term that he got from somewhere, but it means through hearing from someone else. And to him, that's an essential category. It's not something that because we're not smart enough or because we didn't have enough time. Rambam is going to disagree with this very, very explicitly, but this is what his opinion is. And of course, okay, I don't want to get everything, but this is because of his way of thinking, how he thinks more basically. But yeah, that's really what he believes. But we're not talking about mitzvahs right now. We're talking about fact, which is more interesting. So in other words, when he talks about, and this is where we are, when he talks about what is going to happen with the soul, or what kind of punishment does it get, or what kind of survival does it have after death, and so on. These are things that he thinks, again, they must be possible. That we need to figure out, find a theory, and like you're saying, he's working backwards. So we need that, but the thing that we find needs to be true on its own merit. It can't be like we believe this because it says, or I'm telling you this because it says somewhere. He needs to show it from both sources of truth equally, basically. They both have at least equal values for him. But it don't need the second source of truth or the first. The rational source of truth doesn't need to take you as far as the first one can take you. Because it doesn't need to take you to every detail of what kind of Tchesa will be, and so on. It's because he thinks, and this is a question, he probably thinks that this is, you have to really look in the later pieces where I didn't, in the test, he probably doesn't think that these things are knowable. And it's not clear why, that's probably what he thinks. Although they are facts of the world. So it's different than the mitzvahs that you're talking about. Because mitzvahs are both not knowable and both not facts about how the world is. Right? Because mitzvahs just are, and just are, let's say, God's will or God testing you for obedience or something like that. So they're not really facts about the world. Whereas Chesed, for example, is definitely a fact about the world. Maybe you could say about history, about the future. and it's about the world. It's not about something in God's mind.
Something possible in the world.
Yeah, okay, so again, it has to be possible. He has to prove to you that the possibility he has to prove totally logically, like a guy. That's not a question, though. No. He needs to prove to make it possible. But he doesn't need to make it necessary. He doesn't need to prove that it will happen. Because for him, for that, he will just say, well, as long as it, and he explicitly talks about this. He says, as long as they don't have a reason to believe that the prophet wasn't literal, I'm going to just assume that he was literal. Which is very weak. No, the Rambam doesn't think this. The Rambam does. Wait, yeah, okay, we can't get to talk about everything at once. Yeah, he does this game, but the Rambam definitely does this. Uses this three part kind of fact about Chiddush where he literally says that I cannot make it necessary, but I could make it possible. Right. And he does seem to sincerely think that it's possible, although he probably doesn't think that it's probable. But that's another discussion. Okay. No. See, yeah, because he thinks that it's not possible. The Rambam does explicitly say that it's possible, and I don't really know. I don't know. I don't say that people were wrong. I don't say that people are wrong. I don't know. I have no idea. I think that the question of what Mr. Maimonides thought is not interesting, but I also think that no. I think that the Rambam, again, this is like my psychology. I'm not a great psychologist of people that lived 1,000 years ago. But my impression would be that Rambam is sincere when he says that it's possible and not necessary. And for that, and the question is what that means. That's where the interesting question. This is the standard Arab philosophy trick, not trick, like categorization. But I think the interesting question is not, did the Rambam really lie and really think that there is necessary proof for demonstrative proof for Kadmas Olam, as Ibn Tibban and other people might think. The question is what it exactly does for him religiously and philosophically when he says that something is. I don't know if it happened, but I also don't know that it didn't happen. You know what kind of a thing is that? That's at least for me more interesting. Okay, not nine. But for Sadigon doesn't have this problem because he accepts what the tradition says, as long as he doesn't have a good reason to say otherwise. And you can argue about that. You can argue with him about this. He doesn't. In this sense, he's not a very. And the Rambam explicitly criticized him, also in the context of Chiddush Olam, not him by name, but more or less people like him, or basically him, for working backwards. So there's a very long tradition of criticizing Rav Tzaddik for not being enough intellectually honest. But anyways, I think in some other sense he's more intellectually honest because he just says, "Look, I'm a Jew. I believe what it says in the books, and until I have a reason otherwise." And that seems to be very honest, at least in the psychologically honest. If it's not so philosophically rigorous, that's another problem. Okay. And Shine the kids, and therefore I have to say something that he actually says. Therefore, what he does, and I'm going to tell you what he says. Because I don't read things. You'll know how to read. Everyone knows how to read. What he does is he gives you his account of what he thinks it says, and it's actually his account is very interesting. I made a list over here of 6 things that he claims say in the Torah about the soul, and none of them are agreed upon that they actually say, or at least most of them. So he says. It says, and he quotes a pasuk in Zechariah, like, I don't know why he had to go to Zechariah to find this pasuk, what's wrong with Parshas Bereshis, and I don't know. But he says 6 things. Number 1, the soul is created. He brings a pasuk, so basically includes the soul and as part of the things that were created. Just like heaven and earth is soul. Of course, it's not a proof. You could read the pasuk whichever way you want, just like any other pasuk. But that's, and if you want a proof, you should probably use Parshas Bereshis, which is the story of Chiddush Olam. I don't know, but anyways, that's his. So number 1, it's created. Secondly, which is important, and he makes it clear later. It's not. I'm not making stuff up. Is that when was it created? And here he's literally going against Mamre Chazal, or some Mamre Chazal. He says it gets created when the body is created, or when Shlemut Surat Kufo is his language. And his diak from the pasuk is because it says Yitzchok Adam Bekirba. It's actually a good diak. In other words, this pasuk says God creates the spirit, or what he reads as the soul of man, in him. So there must be a him for the soul to be created in. Right. So therefore, when is the soul created? Basically at birth. So for him, abortion is okay. And that's really, I don't know if this is what its abortion is Tullian, then it's okay because he believes, and there's a Gemara about this really that discusses this and sort of gets to this conclusion actually with Antoninus and Rabbi having this discussion, but. According to him, fetuses don't have souls. Only born people have souls because a fetus is not a whole human, and therefore there's no Adam for God to put a soul in. Of course, you could say that maybe there is, he definitely seems to say this, and there's a Gemara Sanhedrin that he might say, but definitely there's many other midrashim and rishonim that explicitly disagree with this and believe that what's not what we can call people call the pre-existence of souls, where all souls were created in Sheshes Me'Bereshis, and there's like in Shemaim, and they're hanging out. Right. So for him, that story never happened because it can't be, because it's created yesh ma'ayin. It's very interesting because nothing is created yesh ma'ayin besides for souls.
So the Bati Malachim knows story never happened.
Yeah, all these malachim talking with the soul, Mashbi and Moisa, it doesn't seem to work for him, for his theory. Or the soul learning everything in the mother's womb. All these things can't really work according to his theory. And the reason he says this is purely traditional. I don't think, maybe there's philosophical reasons for him saying it, but I think it's he mostly has theological reasons for thinking this. He doesn't think, he doesn't like pre-existing things generally. But yeah, this is interesting. And then what does he say? That God has set a certain time for the soul to stay in the body. In other words, as long as a person lives, and he does believe that there's a natural what was known in
God has to be the one to unite and separate these.
Yeah, I don't know. He doesn't. Well, no. So I just told you. Well, God. I don't. Depends what you mean by God here. God does everything. When he says God, that's a good question. When he says God's process, well, God has to create it. That's number one. So he definitely thinks of the soul, every birth being that's what it seems to me again. Yeah, like a Genesis event. In other words, and it's really interesting because nothing else in the world is like this. Everything else he doesn't deny nature in general. Everything else does have natural causes besides for human souls getting into their bodies. So there's no cause. I mean, there might be a cause, of course. A body is born, and there's like some sort of rule that says every time a child is born, God brings souls. And it doesn't. This is really a puzzle for this kind of thought. I discussed this now that made people realize there is a puzzle. It's weird that it's like a rule, but the rule is getting God to do things. I don't know I don't really know what he really thinks about this. I think we have to ask him. Well, if it's in other words, and we have to know better. I should probably we should look in how he describes it later and more times and try to figure out based on how his philosophy works what exactly this would mean, because it is weird. In other words, like whenever it's weird. People have discussed this problem. Anyone that believes in a separate soul has some sort of problem like this. Where like how not only that, how do people human parents cause souls to come, like how does that work? It's a very tricky, very good question. If you have just God to like Deus Ex Machina do it, then it's easy, but that's still weird because nothing else works that way in the world. Or if you're Aristotle, then everything else works that way. But I mean, it's a problem. He's not Aristotelian at all in this way. He's very literal. So I don't know. It's weird because like what? So people make God put souls, and what if he doesn't want? And that's why you have stillborn children. I don't know. I don't know how it's supposed to work. It seems to like sort of it does seem to have regularity, right? It does seem to have most of the time when children are born they're born alive, and you need like some. Well, if you believe in a separate soul, there is something else happening at that point, but maybe it would be easier to say that it's not at that point. I don't know if that makes such a big difference. But anyways, that's.
And even if it's a fact about reality, it's at least an awkward position that it's only in a certain instance that reality decides to access divinity.
That's weird. It's weird.
It doesn't help us much to change the perspective, right? I mean, to act as if this is a property of the world instead of the will of God is not helpful.
Well, then we'd have to give a theory of how exactly this works. Like if you're
is the divine, but it's kind of weird that it only does it here. I mean, by the way, he does believe that plants have souls of some sort, so I don't know. Okay.
Actually, I don't know I don't know about plants. He definitely believes that animals have an afterlife. So I don't know how he actually, if when he's talking about soul, he means animals also. I don't know. He says human soul explicitly. I don't know. Maybe these things were not thought out entirely.
His afterlife is Sadia's afterlife.
No, the afterlife is boring for him. The only point is to be reborn in a body. He doesn't really like the afterlife and the soul-only afterlife. He has a very different theory than everyone else. In other words, he has a theory that I think many other people have implicitly, but don't clarify it, and then you don't realize how weird it is. And you have to figure out his whole theory. He's basically, let me give you what he says here, and then I'll sort of figure out what I understood from what he says. And then he says, now let's talk about the body and the soul. For him, and again, these are all things that I found in other places, and he says, I didn't make them up, but I don't remember now every single word exactly. he does believe that. So you ask why. So he does believe that there's some sort of natural length of life. This was known as the question of the kets. I forgot in Arabic what it was called. If people have a sort of set amount of living, not destiny, and yeah, not fated, not in a supernatural way, in a sort of natural way. In other words, is it? So this was really a question, right? So here he's naturalistic. In other words, but he ascribes it to God. I don't know exactly what that means, right? Because there were like two opinions in Islamic philosophy, including Jewish philosophy. The Jews were mostly on this side because the Jews in general, all the Jews were very rationalists until other people came around. But there was sort of a question of is God, at least relative to the Muslims, the Jews tended to be more rationalist, and the Christians. This was our tradition. What I'm saying is there was like this discussion, like does God have to kill every person, something like that. In other words, we talk in the Bible about people dying because of God, they did some sin and therefore they died, right? So what happens if someone never sins? Will he never die, or something like that? Or is there some sort of natural limit to how long people live, and at that point you will just die even if you're the biggest tzaddik? You talk about automation, I don't know, but that was like a question, a live question in their context. Some people would say no, everyone just dies when God decides for him to die, and theoretically you could live forever, or theoretically, you could die tomorrow and just God said. In other words, there's no difference between having a full life and there's no such a thing as an amount of life.
No internal quality of
yeah, there's no like you should naturally live to 91 and then of course you have a car accident.
The soul has an internal longevity. Maybe this is a 76-year soul.
No, they continue, not the soul. Well, the soul also because it was created at that point, but also the connection of body and soul for him have a sort of natural tendency at least to, let's say, live 70 years or whatever. Like the Tehillim says something like that, then of course you could die in a car accident, which is another way of saying you died before your time, right? This language, you say someone died before the time, must assume that there is a time, right? Because if you're like a real Frima guy, you said no such thing as a time. That was his time. No, there is a time. In other words, his body had the ability to live a certain amount, 70 years. Now happens to be there was a car accident. Maybe that car accident happened because he didn't have either. Or sometimes you say
in this circumstance, God comes down and separates
it. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I think so. He would consider that a special punishment. He does have this. Yeah, I think so. Maybe humans can do it also because of free will and stuff like that, which gets into that discussion. But that would be like a Yetzirah. That would be like
it's an intervention of sorts.
I don't know if the soul going out of the body when someone kills you is some kind of magic. You see, that just happens. I think. But the point.
The body ceases, so the soul is
yeah, I don't know how his theory. See, again, I don't know exactly. I don't know what does everyone else think. He does seem to have this point. This is what I'm reading in this line. He does seem to agree that there is, like I'm saying, there's like you can have a full life. You can have a very long life. Maybe like you ate very healthy food, or you did a big mitzvah and you lived like to 96 instead of to 91 or whatever.
This soul can be affected like a real property. I mean, it has a real property of longevity.
No, we're going to talk about this soon. We're talking now about the connection of the body and the soul, not of the. He actually does believe that it theoretically could live forever because of his Kiyas theory is basically that. So, okay. but he sees that as a sort of change in the body also. So I'm not sure. At least so that therefore there is a God deciding things, but God decides things in sort of more making sense way. In other words, when God puts your soul into your body, He's like gives it a time limit also. He says like, well, you're gonna have the kind of connection for 70 years, and that's how it is. Okay. That's important. Okay, and then at the end He separates them. He actually has a whole story, and if you read I've put it here. If I'm reading off my notes, so he actually gives the story of how it gets separated. So in natural death, at least, I don't know what he would think about a car accident, and he definitely says something about it, but I don't remember how it makes sense with this, how it works together. But he definitely thinks that like he believes he has this whole story of he literally gives a story of the Malach Mavas coming with some sort of sword and taking the neshama away. Why we need a Malach Mavas, whatever, that's how it works. But so there's like a specific story of the soul leaving. He even has the question, so I never saw it leave. Which window does it go out of? He even asks that question. So it's a real event, at least. It's not nothing that's just like a byproduct of some other event. And now this is important. Now this whole process is the way things happen nowadays in this world, so to speak. But God has in His mind or in His plan some sort of amount of souls that He wants to embody. Not amount of souls, not to embody, to create, right? Important, because they don't pre-exist. So he has a certain amount of. He decided when he created the world, he wants to create 10 million souls or 10 trillion or whatever the amount is, and he's just running through his plan, and then that will end at some point. Very important.
This is what? This is like
This is a story. What?
Okay, but it's
This
not that
is
these souls pre-existed.
no, exactly. They didn't pre-exist. He has a plan. They exist in the sense of being a God has in his accounting book. There need to be 7 trillion souls or whatever it is.
But those will be created when the body
Yeah,
is formed.
exactly. They don't actually exist before that. Very important. And therefore, that's how long the world will last. Basically, this world, what we call this world, in the sense of this kind of way of the world working, people being born and dying. That's the main point. Then what happens after that is when this finishes, which is called base. Then comes the real Tchesem. Then God had enough of this stage of the world, and He puts everyone back together in their bodies. Puts all the souls back together with their bodies, the souls with their bodies very individually, and gives them reward and punishment. That's what Chesem, the ultimate Chesem is.
What the actualization?
And then they go on.
justice
No, actualize. Well, no,
not
nothing.
justice, punishment and reward on this.
Yes,
on this
exactly.
world.
The real punishment and reward, or basically ultimate one, is only in body because he doesn't see. We'll figure out the philosophy later, but he definitely doesn't believe that souls without body are really worth much. They exist, but sort of in a very not an abstract sense, but in a very boring sense. They can't do anything. He says they don't have any activity, so they can't do anything. They just exist in an inert way. And maybe in some the tzaddikim have it slightly better than the Rishonim, but it makes no big deal, or there's not a real scharvonish at least. But the real scharvonish is literal in this world, and we're in the next to the sun, literally, in some location, some place. You want to go find them? Take a rocket ship and find them. You could find them somewhere. I mean, not literally, probably not because they're very small. Whatever, he has a theory of how exactly it works, but they're physical. He's a physicalist in that sense, and what do I say? But we'll get to this in a second. We'll actually get this in 6 weeks if we continue on the process. Hopefully, because we have to go through a lot of other things before that. But this is his basic theory. I'm just gonna tell you his basic theory, and this is a weird theory, but it's probably also the theory of the Rambam and many other great, maybe some like Kabbalah and so on. So you have to remember. Sadia has a, but this is not yet. Well, let me finish what he says here, which is what happens with the soul. Then I'll tell you what it is because he didn't talk about what it is. So I have to differentiate about this. But what is about the soul? This is what happens. So this is the story. It gets created when the person is born. It lives out his life. It does mitzvahs, avodas, whatever. Accumulates some sort of accounting of good and bad, which is really the point, which is another whole part of his theory. And then at the end of the world, at the end of the world, which is predefined, as many people as have to exist, you can't change, you can't affect when it happens. Whenever that will be, maybe in 6,000 years, maybe more, maybe less. He doesn't seem to take the 6,000 number very seriously, but he does think that there is some end. And at that time, all people will come back together, and that's the time of what the Muslims call the ultimate judgment day. Okay, and then the people that were good will live forever. The people who are bad will have will get fires burned and stuff, all kind of bad stuff, and that's the end. And then the good people will live literally forever with a body. They will not have to eat because that's a waste of time. But they'll enjoy themselves forever with their bodies. And he thinks that that's reasonable. He tries to prove that that's reasonable. There's nothing inherently wrong with a body not eating and just continue to exist. The Rambam is going to make fun of it and say, well, what's the point of having a body then? He doesn't think that. Anyways, that's his theory of the world, of how it happens. And this is very another, going back to reading the text, this is more or less what Chazal say, and at least in many other places, taking out the pre-existence part, this is more or less what they believe. He does believe in a secondary Tchias HaMesim, which is like part of Mashiach, which has nothing to do with the ultimate Tchias HaMesim. So some good Jews there will wake up, will be resurrected at the time of Mashiach, just because it's a shame they suffered in Golas and then can't see Mashiach, so they might as well be resurrected. But that's not the main event that he's talking about, which is sort of a universal event and is the ultimate Schar Vaynish. So Sean, that's his theory, and Schar Vaynish can only happen to a soul and a body together, because otherwise it doesn't make any sense. And there's a little fetish Gemara that says that. So this is very much a traditional view And he says that he brings like a posik. I don't know why he thought that this posik is supposed to prove that. I mean, I understand where it says, but like I don't get the big proof. But this seems to be, we could probably bring better proofs, and at least from Chazal, that this is sort of the story that they have in mind. Okay, that's one. Then he says, therefore, we have proofs for this is what we believe in the sense of testimony because the prophets told us. And what do I want to tell you? Yeah, and then just to figure out, then the next step that he has is now we need to make all this possible. This is a nice story, and you should believe it. But I need to at least show you that it's possible. So for that to be possible, I need to have a kind of, that's basically the logic of this thing. I need to have the kind of soul for which this all is possible. Therefore, he goes through a list of opinions that he's found somewhere about what the soul is. So what is essence, or what kind of thing it is. And then he's going to sort of give his opinion, which makes these things work. And his opinion is basically that the soul is a physical thing. Doesn't literally say the word physical, but yeah, it's a physical thing. It's very, very, very. He calls it very fine, so it's not made out of the same kind of matter as everything else. It's made out of the kind of matter that the stars are made out of, which for him is a different kind of matter. So this is a theory that you never heard of, probably, but there's a theory that said that there's different levels of matter, or different. They call them less fine and more fine. There's one of the, if you read like pre-Socratics, you'll find this theory somewhere. Forgot to add it, and the sun and the moon and the stars are made out of some sort of more elevated matter, but they're matter. In other words, they're not in a different category. They're material things. They're not spiritual. He sometimes called it spiritual. No, nothing to do with consciousness in those things.
No, not consciousness.
Again.
The idea that they were.
No, nothing to do.
For him was an intelligence, right?
Yeah. He's not. No, nothing to do with that theory. That's what I'm saying. You should not think of this theory. You have not heard of this theory. I'm telling you.
Okay.
This is a materialist theory. Materialist theory. There is not intelligences and stuff. Everything is made out of matter. Now, but there's different kinds of matter. There's more elevated matter and less elevated. The only thing that doesn't have matter, everything is a body. That's the Greek term. Everything is a body. Everything besides for God for him. There were Stoics that said even God is a body. But he doesn't have that. For him, God is not a body, but he's the only thing to exist without a body. Nothing else exists without a body besides for God, the one God. Everything else is bodies. Just bodies of different sorts. There's more elevated, the more supernal bodies, more. Of course, the star is greater than you, so it's a sort of made out of some sort of better body than you. And the soul is something like that. It's like made out of matter of the kind of the stars, and that's what the Pusik says. And he takes this verse Pusik very literally. So the souls of the righteous will be as stars, and they are basically as stars. If you're a bigger tzaddik, you're a bigger star, and you're a smaller star, or something like that. And that's what a soul is. And it somehow connects with the body and makes it alive, of course. And then it can go out. And it literally goes out, and he literally asks the question, like, how does it go out if you don't see it? How did everyone ever see? What if all the windows are closed? And he says, well, I told you, because it's very fine. It can go through windows and walls. So, but not through in a spiritual way. Through in in the radio waves way, right? Just because it doesn't care, it doesn't, right? Radio waves are physical. Right, yeah, it just somehow can go through it. It's on a different, it's smaller, That's his way of conceptualizing it.
Like light can go through a window?
Yeah, basic. That's how he would say it. Light is just a physical particle, but it doesn't not bothered by glass. Very, very simple. And shine. And then when it dies, it doesn't do anything. And now his point, for him, it's important that that's his theory of the soul, and I think that was the Ramban's theory. So in other words, the soul is a physical thing. It exists in a certain place, so it's literally in your body, not in any metaphorical sense. It's in your body, and it makes the body alive, and it also acts through the body. In other words, this thing can only act through a body. It cannot act by itself because it doesn't sort of have enough extension in space, or I don't know exactly why. Therefore, when it doesn't have a body, it can basically do nothing. It sort of sleeps, and that's why it needs a body to come back to have tchesemais and to have that's his point. Anyways, what? No, it's not a ghost in a machine. It's not a ghost. It's a machine. It's just a machine in a machine. You have to remember. Okay. It's a mechanic. It's a physical thing, and it probably influences the body in a physical way. It probably He doesn't have a soul body problem because he only has bodies. He has a body problem. He has two bodies.
What I'm saying is
working one through the other.
And the soul acts on the body in a very physical way. You're saying?
Yeah. Probably in whichever way, yeah. In the same way the stars act on us in some way. Although they're in a different kind of matter, that's not a problem. They still matter. And the soul can not only act on the body, he calls it acts through the body, right? Because its own actions are somehow.
Okay, but that's more what I meant when I said goes in the machine. Meaning that you have to just apply one physical or quasi-physical thing to another to animate it.
Yeah, but okay, in some sense, I don't know exactly how. I don't know if this theory is still worked out to know exactly what it means. But this seems to sort of be what he holds. And like I said, I think that this theory of the soul being a thing is this is what important for me, because we're gonna get this where he says it more explicitly. And think about the Ramban and Shara Kamil is very against the Aristotelian theories of soul, and the big problem that he has is that then the soul can't be in a place. And of course, the Aristotle spoke about it and they had a teretz for it, but the Ramban doesn't really want to have of any of it. And he says, well, then what do you mean? I've read the Chazal, there's a Gehenna, and they go places. And therefore, he says we must believe that the soul is something. Well, let me try to see if I have it. I want to know if I'm correct. He says something like, but Rav Sadigan definitely has a physical soul, and some people are very not happy, and they want to say he must not mean it seriously, but I don't see any reason why not to think that he means it seriously, as far as I can tell. And also, I don't see anything inherently unreasonable in this. I mean, why shouldn't there be true? Yeah, the Ramban literally says he talks about, for example, here, look. הנפש, ככה קבל את רב סלני, שהקדוש ברוך הוא בורא נפש סיים צדיק, ובלי ספק ריח זקה, אין הגיף, ולא נגבלס, ואין נגדרס במקום, אלא מקת המלוכים. He says it's not a body, but he basically thinks that it is a kind of body. I think that it kind of light. I'm pretty sure that that's that is what I think. I think when he says not body, he means just not the kind of body that a more supernal body or a more elevated body. Because that's the only way I've learned this a long time. The only way that you can make it work is by having the soul be a kind of body, just not the same kind of us. What he means, and a gif, he just means not made out of the four elements, which he thinks everything is made out of, but some kind of something else. Because otherwise, you just don't end. He says it's not stuck in place, but it could be in a place. Well, as long as place is a bodily thing, then it can only be in a place. And regarding the fire of Gehenna, he literally says that it's a guf dak ma'od. Dakam is he uses this language of dak, which is fine.
Gehenna is fine.
Yeah, something very, very fine. And somehow it's fine enough to connect with the soul. So the soul is, I think that's what we have to take it to mean.
Not microscopic.
Yeah, you could say something like that. That's how we would conceptualize it.
Right, so that's some sort of on the fine plane, the soul is roasting.
Yeah. He quotes the guide, whatever. I feel like there's something confused, but because he says that it doesn't make sense. But yeah. And also, I think that we're very used to having abstract theories, and there's nothing really crazy about these kind of theories. We're just not used to them. I mean, the Socrates thinks that they're crazy, and Plato, and so on. But they were very serious people that had such theories, and there's not really a good reason to. Again, there's nothing crazy about it. What's crazy about it? The Rambam seems to criticize such a theory in the Moreh Nevuchim, and when he talks about Kalam. And where he says something, we'll get to it. Then another point. Seems to say that it doesn't help, but I'm not really sure what his problem is. He seems to make fun of such a theory. But why wouldn't the soul be just a physical thing? Like, we have to get to why we need a soul at all. But in any case, for whichever reason we need a soul to exist, it doesn't seem to be some inherently crazy by having it just be another kind of physical thing. This might not work for the modern arguments like about consciousness and intentionality, but for what they needed a soul, it probably doesn't work. There's probably good reasons for it not to be physical, but Rav Sadia definitely thinks that everything is a body besides for God. So that's all. The main point is that then all the things that Chazal say make work. That's really where he needs to get. But he also needs to be separable, so we'll get to all the different things about it next time or another time. Anyway, that's enough.